Welcome everybody to the Kubernetes community call. I'm Tim Pepper, an open source developer at VMware and today's meeting moderator. This meeting has a rotating set of volunteers moderating, taking notes, as well as presenting. And if you want to contribute, I suggest reaching out to Jorge Castro, or George rather, Jorge on Slack to volunteer. The meeting is being recorded. Please mute your microphone if you're not speaking as a courtesy to the other speakers. For those presenting and asking questions, just be mindful that we have a full agenda and time slots. We do want a collaborative meeting, obviously, but at times we might have to take something offline just to keep the conversation there going and keep the meeting going as well. The meeting minutes are being kept in a Google Doc by Jace, and the meeting recording is being run by George and will be posted to the Kubernetes YouTube channel following the meeting. So first off today, we have a Kubernetes on Docker for Mac demo, which I think should be pretty exciting for folks. And take it away.
Sorry, can you see my screen?
Your screen is coming up, but the audio is very quiet.
Okay. Is it better that way?
That is some yes, as you're getting closer.
Okay. Okay. So what I'm going to show is Kubernetes working on Docker for Mac. So since it shipped a few weeks ago, and so today, if you're going to docker.com to get Docker for Mac, there are two channels for Docker for Mac, the stable channel and the edge channel. And in the edge channel, if you're installing it, you have a new set of preferences there. So here I'm showing you my preferences. I can set file sharing.
I'm sorry to interrupt. If you're not speaking, if you're not Patrick, please mute your phone. We're having a whole bunch of background noise and it's very hard to hear him.
Yeah. And so in advanced here, you can set the memory for Docker. You can set proxies. You can set some flags on the daemons. But the new preference that you see here is Kubernetes. So if you enable Kubernetes, you will have a one node Kubernetes cluster installed with Docker. And here I say show system containers because I want to see the Kubernetes containers running in there. So here I see that Docker is running and Kubernetes is running. When you install Docker for Mac, it installs kubectl, or however it's pronounced these days. So I can do a kubectl get nodes, and I'll see that on my Mac I have a Kubernetes cluster called Docker for Desktop. It's ready, and it has one node, and it's using version 1.8.2. So I just nuked it. I just removed everything in my cluster before doing this demo. So I'm just going to show you. Another thing I wanted to show you is that if you're going to, or maybe I should make that bigger. If you're going to home.kube config, you'll see that when you install Docker, it has created a configuration for your local Kubernetes cluster for kubectl to discover it. This configuration is added to the one that you eventually had. So if you need to switch context, the name of the cluster is called Docker for Desktop. And this is all described in the documentation. So I wanted to show you a few things you can do with this. So the first one is let's run nginx. So I'm just going to do a kubectl run nginx on port 80. Okay, so my my deployment has been created. So then I can do a kubectl get deployment or get deployments. Oh, sorry. And I can see that I have my my Hello Nginx deployment. Then I can describe it. Oops, Hello Nginx. And here I can see that it's been deployed, and there's one replica on one that has been created, so it's ready to use. I can do a kubectl get pods to see the pods that have been created. And then if I want to expose it, I'm just going to expose that as a service with type node port, so that I can now go to localhost on port 80. What is it doing? And oh, I don't know what's wrong there. So let me see the service that I have there. So I have my Hello Nginx that exposed as a node port on port 80. But the node port is 30,636. Okay, and here I have my Hello Nginx, which is working in my kube cluster, exposed by a service through a node port. And once I've done that, I can start scaling it. So I can scale it to 3 replicas here. And then I can check that I have the right pods that have been created. So here I can see my pods getting up and running. So that's it for how to get started with Kubernetes on Docker for Mac. Then there's one thing that's super interesting is that Kubernetes comes with a dashboard, and the dashboard is not pre-installed. So I'm just going to follow the and install the Kubernetes dashboard to my local cluster. In order for the security of it to work, I need to create an admin user. So I created that YAML file where I create a role and a service account for the Kubernetes dashboard. So I'm just going to create that admin role. And once I'm done, I can do a kubectl proxy. There you go, it's proxy to this. And then if I go to, where have I think I have it in there. And then I'm going through the proxy to the dashboard that's running inside of my kube cluster. And there you can see that I can see everything in a graphical user interface. You can see my 3 Nginx pods running, my replica sets, my services. So I can do everything from the dashboard, and that's pretty convenient. So another thing that you may want to do is there are lots of people are packaging their application containing several services using a system called Helm. So I have installed the Helm client on my Mac before. And there, in order to install Helm on the kube cluster, I need to create a role for Tiller, a role called Tiller that Helm is going to use to deploy my applications. So I have created a YAML file there. Let me just go.
Patrick, we do have a number of questions queuing up in the chat, and I want to make sure we leave a couple of minutes for those still.
Okay, so let me just create that quickly. Okay, so I installed Helm, and then I just do a Helm init. Okay, so I have installed Helm on my cluster, and the last thing I wanted to show was how to install Monocular, which is a UI for Helm. And so here I need to set up an ingress. Just going to do that. Maybe if we are lacking on time, I'm going to write a blog post explaining how to install Monocular and how to show it. And then once you've done all that, you're able to install things either with Helm on the command line or just clicking in the UI with Monocular to install all the packages that are available in Helm. You can also install Prometheus on that. A lab that shows how to do G2E application, and that lab has a Docker Compose file. And because the Kubernetes cluster is using the Docker daemon that ships with Docker for Mac, when you're building containers on that Docker engine, they are available to schedule with Kubernetes. And with the Compose and Kubernetes integration, you can do a Docker stack deploy with a Compose file, and that will deploy that to your Kubernetes cluster as Kubernetes resources, as we demoed at DockerCon. So that's kind of a very, very short way of showing a lot of the stuff that you can do with Kubernetes on your Mac. Now, maybe let's go to the Q&A.
Yeah, so that's a really cool demo, and I think it leads directly into the first question that some people are going to have. Is it coming for Windows and Linux?
Linux, not right now. I think Windows, definitely, it's in the plans, and I think it's coming pretty soon. I don't want to give you a date yet because our engineering team is working on it, but it's pretty soon.
Then there were a couple of questions around configurability. Can you use your own kube control, specify a kube config file to switch between them, or how flexible is it in that regard?
Yeah, so kube control, we install it as a convenience on the Mac when you're installing Docker for Mac. But you can get your own version of it, and that will work. So you get the kube control version that for Mac. And then the configuration is the one that I showed that's in home.kube config. So you can have your other Kubernetes clusters in there, and you can configure the parameters in there the traditional way. So what other questions? How does it translate the Compose file to Kubernetes deployment? Does it use Compose? No, it doesn't use Compose. We're using a CRD, a CRDT. Yeah, Arun answered that question. So it's using a CRD that Docker designed, where the Docker command line, when you do a Docker stack deploy, it's understanding that it's talking to Kubernetes. It talks to that CRD, and then that CRD is creating a new service object in Kubernetes, and it translates the Compose files into a Kubernetes deployment and a set of services. Is it open sourced? I don't know. I don't think so. No, because the team is still working on that, I think. The CRD part, I don't think so. You may find the client part on the Docker client code base, but the server part, I don't think so. And this CRD is also used in Docker Enterprise Edition with Kubernetes installed.
So I think we need to start moving on for time, but obviously a lot of interest. As you draft up that blog post that you mentioned, please share out the link. And I can imagine there's going to be a lot of interest in this at KubeCon and other forums in the future. So keep sharing the information. I think people are really appreciating it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So next up is the release update from Jace.
All right. Thank you very much. Put a link in the agenda that has the schedule. So if you want to follow along, we are in week 3 of 12 right now. So 25% of the release is underway or done. And we were supposed to have an alpha this week, but the alpha has certain dependencies on Google ACLs and whatnot. And they are not really set up for Caleb yet. And Caleb had a bit of a bicycle fiasco, which he's okay and everything, but he's taking a little bit of bedtime to recover from that. And so being the branch manager, that's something that he would do. So he's going to focus on getting the privileges set up for that and whatnot. And we'll announce when the first alpha comes out. Again, the alpha is really intended to capture the steps necessary to cut it, make sure we have the privileges in place and whatnot. So this is exactly the circumstances that we had planned for by having an alpha that early. There is a link to the features that are currently slated in the 110 milestone, and I believe Ihor is here, and he can just give us a quick rundown on that.
Ihor is here, thanks Jace. So yeah, feature freeze deadline is next Monday, January 22nd. And I strongly ask everybody who is developing some new feature for Kubernetes 1.10 to add and to change to add this feature to Kubernetes features repo, or if it's already there, please update the milestone to 1.10. Today we have terribly low number of features for 1.10. I can expect that the real number is much bigger. Also, don't forget please about the features tracking spreadsheet. And yeah, that's all from me. All the links are in the meeting notes if you need them.
I'm not sure if Mehdi or David are here, but 192 is slated for release today. And 187 is out by my doppelganger, David Oppenheimer. Check my Twitter if you don't believe it. And I think that's it for releases. Any
Thanks,
questions?
Jace. Also give a shout out to your Twitter. You kind of talked about your origin story, and I think in this context of the community call, it's really cool to see people sharing stories like that. Thank you.
Thank you for mentioning it. It's truly my pleasure.
Next up is George with our graph of the week.
All right, can everyone see that?
Yes, it's coming through.
Okay, so I'll be really fast. I was looking through the CNCF graphs, and I was kind of wondering how the holidays affected everyone. So these are the approves that were done in December, and if you see this line here, that's where there was the obvious dip. And then one thing that I thought was also interesting was there's a approvers histogram. So as I went through the months, I've noticed that depending on the months, different people are active at different times. So if you're one of the persons that's kind of hurting for a review, you can come to this histogram and go either by day or week and see who's been really active lately if you're fishing for a review, which I thought was cool. And the last bit is I did think that this specific graph was showing the total number of approvers, and it did not do that. So when I filed a bug, if you file a bug and you're confused, the CNCF folks will walk you through exactly what they're graphing and how, and I thought that was really useful. And that's it for me.
All right, thanks, George. Aaron gives a thumbs up. So next up, we have SIG updates. We've got, I think, 2, 3 on the list. First of all is SIG docs and Devin.
Okay, unmuted. And I'm going to share some slides I whipped up for this, if you all don't mind.
And we can see them.
Great. Okay. So this is going to function a little bit as a sort of the state of Kubernetes docs currently, and where we've why we've made the decisions that we have as SIG docs from version 1.4 to today, version 1.9. Circa 1.4, around that time, everybody knew that Kubernetes documentation was a problem, but nobody could really articulate what about it was a problem. So SIG docs underwent an investigation, and what we found is that largely structural issues were really hurting us. Most of the SIG docs doesn't generate a lot of the content just because it's very hard to get full-time contributors in SIG docs. We really rely on the other SIGs to generate a lot of documentation for new features and for releases, but SIG docs is responsible for putting it all basically in some kind of order. And what we found is that around the era of 1.4/1.5, most community authored content was done in the form of user guides that were organized per feature. This is a snapshot of 1.5 docs, and you can see everything organized in user guides, and watch this. It just keeps going and going and going and getting more and more nested. And actually asking anybody to find something in this is pretty darn difficult. Most of the documentation is what we call feature-centric documentation, as in everybody wrote guides that said, this is my feature, and this is what it does. And what that relies on is for users to actually know what your feature is and be able to identify it by name in order to find any content about it. So like, if anybody wants to learn to use cluster federation, for example, they need to know that federation associates multiple clusters together and actually know what federation is before they know that they can use it to associate multiple clusters together. Most of the time we've found that users really only know their task ahead of time rather than what feature name they use to accomplish it. Another related structural issue was differentiating between content for setup, core Kubernetes primitives, and environment-specific tools. All of it was just kind of mushed together. In addition, each of these guides topics had a lot of variance. The structure was ad hoc. Some of them had a lot of step-by-step instructions. Some of them had design background. Some of them had troubleshooting sections, and all of them were, some of them had all of those things. And the more you put in a single topic, the more you risk overloading the reader and giving them a bunch of information that isn't relevant to them and making them go, I can't find anything, and just giving up before they find what they need. So what we tried to do is move docs to a task-based organization where we understand the reader's operational context and give them just the information they need. Rather than try to teach a user everything about everything, we want to determine what a user might want to accomplish and give them just the instructions they need for that. If a user is trying to accomplish a task, they usually don't need design background or any discussion of implementation trade-offs or background on how the universe used to be before this feature existed. All of those things were included in 1.5's guides. We found that if users want that information, they tend to explicitly search for it. So what did we do? We set up documentation to be organized around a user's operational context. We decided on these 4 core things, actually 5 because setup falls into them. They are tasks, tutorials, concepts, and reference. Tasks are generic instructions. I want to learn how to do something. I need instructions for it. I will sort of insert my own context. I will insert my own cluster name. A tutorial is a real world example of, like, say, how do I set up WordPress or something on my cluster? Concepts are actual background and design information, and reference is basically the index or the encyclopedia of everything. This basically means that topics, our guides, get broken up into multiple topics of these types. But the way we hold everything together is by linking them together. Tasks can link out to concepts. So in case the user actually wants some background information when doing their tasks, they can follow the link, but it doesn't lengthen the documentation or mess with the order by putting it in the middle of it. Basically, the idea is to make the documentation more focused and less likely to bury information or overwhelm the reader. We created templates for each of these operational contexts. That makes it, in a way, that makes it a lot easier to write docs because you can follow the template per context and not wonder exactly how much information you need to include. And we revamped the style and contribution guides. Admittedly, that getting everybody to shift to a new writing style means that review processes can be painful and more labor intensive, but we think it's been worth it for the documentation. We put this new structure in place around 1.6. And as you can see in 1.9, the difference between 1.9 and 1.5, 1.5 was very cluttered. 1.9 is much cleaner. The top level menus are a lot cleaner. And we feel that things are a lot easier to find these days. So how do you document a feature now in an upcoming release? You may need to write multiple topics, unlike before, but they are shorter topics. Tasks organized by use case, concepts for background, and tutorials for basically demos. SIG Docs maintainers can provide guidance. We have an editor, Zach Corlison from CNCF. And Andrew Chen and Steve Perry have been instrumental in installing all this new structure and migrating the existing content over it, and they are a great resource for you. What are we doing next? We need to work on better entry points for the documentation, which we're trying to do with critical user journeys. Automation for automatically generated reference docs. That process is still extremely labor intensive and error prone. Support for localization and translation, organizing and standardizing contributor-centric documentation, and finally, continuing to support our quarterly launches. And that's all I have.
Hey, thank you for that. I, for one, as a relative newcomer into Kubernetes, am finding the reorganization there and simplification very good. And also from a Contribex perspective, even though it's having to contribute multiple docs in multiple places, potentially now the split between those and that they're smaller, I think makes it less intimidating to somebody, and it makes it easier to spread the load across contributors. So I think this is awesome stuff. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Next up is SIG Network with Dan Williams.
Hello, everybody. I've put some notes into the agenda doc, so you can follow along there if you want. I'll just do a really quick overview of some of the features and work that we've identified for the 110 cycle. One of the more important ones of those, and the one that's been getting a lot of attention, is IPv6 single and dual stack. The single stack support is almost all there for 1.9, or is all there. I forget which, but is marked alpha, I believe. We'd like to move that to beta for beta or GA, I forget which, for 110. But then we also want to continue working on the dual stack support. And to clarify here, single versus dual stack, if you're not aware, single means you can run the cluster and data plane in either IPv6 or IPv4. But you have to pick one of those. And dual stack means that you can run in either of those or both at the same time. So that, for example, pods could have IPv4 addresses and IPv6 addresses. You could have nodes with IPv4 and IPv6 addresses. So that's dual stack. And we hope to get there soon. Next one is IPVS proxy to, I think it's GA. Or excuse me, beta. And part of that is we added that for 1.9, and it's kind of alpha quality, I think. And we want to continue improving that and adding some CI integration for that to make sure that we get it tested well enough, which is kind of one of the things that needs to happen for GA features, and then also continue to kind of fix the bugs there. It's already being used in production, I believe in, I want to say Huawei's cloud deployment. So it is getting some quite a bit of testing there and some other places. We're also going to continue moving more of KubeNet to the CNI reference plugins to try to continue to spin out all the kind of default networking and simplify that quite a bit. Obviously, the end goal here is to keep a very simple, easy default network for Kubernetes, but just push the maintenance of that code out into the CNI project as opposed to attempting to maintain all that in Kube itself. This work has been going on for a while and it's still ongoing. One of the things that is currently being worked on is bandwidth shaping quality of service, which the KubeNet plugin currently does by itself, but we do have a plugin PR for CNI that implements that. And then once, so that's one part of that. And there's a few other little things that need to happen there. Also, Windows code and compatibility has been a big focus for the last couple of months. We have Windows support for Kube Proxy's IP tables type mode. It's obviously not IP tables, since IP tables is Linux only, but it sort of follows that same kind of pattern that the IP tables part uses. So that's an option for Kube Proxy already. We'd like to continue working on that and potentially move that to, I think, beta. And then there's also a bunch of networking related PRs and updates, even in the CNI project, to add some plugins analogous to the CNI's Bridge plugin for Windows, which could potentially be used for Kubernetes default installs on Windows. There's also the multiple pod IP address effort that is partly required for the IPv6 dual stack, because right now a pod can only have one IP address in the Kube API. And obviously, if you're going to allow pods to have IPv4 and IPv6 addresses, we need to have multiple IP addresses. There's also some implications there around health checking, because we've found a number of use cases while implementing network plugins that work with Kubernetes to have health checking on a separate IP address from the pod's actual data plane itself. So we're continuing to work through some of that. There's a couple of different use cases here for multiple pod IP addresses, and part of the effort is to find a solution that works for all of them, or at least many of them, but doesn't impose too much complexity on the Kube API. Also, coming out of some of the KubeCon discussions, nothing specific here is going to hit 110, but there is some dissatisfaction with the current service API. It's not quite as flexible for some things as we'd like. And so we're going to continue to explore what might happen there. Obviously, this is a big, big topic because making any changes to this API needs to either be backwards compatible, or we need to start a whole deprecation cycle for some of this. So that's just something that we're going to continue keeping under discussion. And then lastly, topology-aware ingress is another thing that sort of ties in with services. This is related to the Kubernetes feature that landed, I believe, in 1.7 about local backends for the proxy, so that when traffic comes into a node, that node prefers a pod backing that service on the node itself, as opposed to forwarding that traffic on to a different node. Topology-aware ingress is mainly around, well, what if that node knew a little bit more about the topology around it, so that it could, for example, direct that request to another node in its same rack or in its same group or something like that, if it does not actually have a pod backing that service on itself. So trying to optimize some of that ingress a little bit. So those are most of the items that we've talked about in SIG Network for 110. And then kind of outside of that, there's still continued work on somewhat more flexible pod networking through an informal network plumbing working group that we started at KubeCon, or at least kicked off at KubeCon. And that's taking the place, or a lot of the multiple networking discussions and some of the more complex networking discussions have sort of moved into that working group so that we don't spend too much time in SIG network on those kinds of large discussions, but instead that we're able to stay a little bit more tactical on cube releases and dealing with flakes and bugs and that sort of thing. So that's it for the update. Were there any questions?
Doesn't look like any went by in chat, and we are slightly ahead of schedule, so if anybody had one, feel free to speak up.
Sure. And obviously, if you have questions, you can also direct them to the SIG Network Google group, as well as the SIG Network Slack channel.
Okay, thanks, Dan. A number of really complex technical concepts there in progress described very succinctly. Thank you. So our next SIG update was going to be SIG Service Catalog, but Paul is out sick, so that will probably happen next week. And then up next is the steering committee governance update from Philip.
Hey everyone. Yeah, so I'm giving a quick update on the work we're doing around SIG governance, and wanted to ask that everyone fill out a survey to give their insights. Real quickly, our goals are to help the community self-organize by providing a template charter for SIGs and some governance structure for them to take advantage of. What we've done so far is we've reached out to SIG leads and had a long-form questionnaire that asked a bunch of questions that we were grappling with, and got pretty detailed insight from many leaders within the community about how their SIGs function, and found a really diverse set of results, and that unsurprisingly different SIGs have very different needs and different amount of desired structure. And so we're currently trying to, or working on developing a template which defines that structure for SIGs to then fill out and customize for their specific needs. And as part of that, we'd like to get the insights and experiences that the community's had within their SIGs and how they feel about the functioning. And so we put together a small questionnaire. It's about 7 questions that are all multiple choice or checkbox that you can give us feedback and say, I really like the way my SIG functions in these areas, or I'd really like to see some focus around these other areas. So if you'd like your voice to be heard, and to contribute your experiences back to the end product, go ahead and fill that out sometime this week. That's all. Any questions? Nope.
Looks like nothing in the chat and no one online, so thank you for that. And yeah, fill that out, everybody on the call, and share it in your circles. Get more people, more contributors filling it out. This brings us to announcements for the week. We've got some Google Summer of Code updates from Ihor, I think, next.
Right. So you may heard that Google Summer of Code proposals are currently running, and CNCF is supporting this initiative for our projects, including Kubernetes first of all. So if you are interested in participating in Google Summer of Code as a mentor or as a student, please take a look at the page, at the link in the community meeting notes that routes you to CNCF repo, the Google Summer of Code repo on the CNCF organization. Also, I'd like to mention that Nikita, who has been a student last year for Google Summer of Code, this year she's volunteered to be to drive this initiative for Kubernetes community. So if you have any questions regarding Google Summer of Code, if you have any proposals regarding Google Summer of Code for Kubernetes in this year, feel free to reach me and Nikita directly. That's all from me.
All right, thank you. There's a mention in the agenda, just a reminder that KubeCon, Cloud Native Con, SIG Intro Deep Dive sessions are going to be announced soon. So keep your eye out for the registration on those. And then finally, some information about changes to this meeting's format from George.
Yeah, I'll be quick. So in the past, we've scheduled these meetings. The SIG updates have been ad hoc, but as the number of SIGs and working groups is growing, that's been becoming unmanageable. So what we're going to do, I proposed this to the SIG leads and actually got a unanimous decision. What we're going to do is actually set a schedule for all the SIGs for the entire cycle for your SIG updates, so that we'll know exactly how many SIG updates you'll have. We'll have exactly 3 per meeting instead of 1 sometimes and 4 the next. And it will allow the SIGs basically to plan ahead of time and to make things a little bit more tightened up in that regard. We're also going to make some demo changes. We're going to start to ask demo people to show up 10 minutes early, practice with mics, and we're going to tighten up the requirements for demos, things like headsets and things like that, after we realize that this meeting gets expensive and things like that. We're also going to ask demo people who are going to go to also be available a week early in case there is a technical problem. We can just punt that person, do them later, and move on to somebody else so that we're more efficient and more professional in that regard. And also, just a quick call that we always need note takers. Jace kind of always gets stuck with it, and that's a real shame considering that the amount of people that come to the meeting. So please consider volunteering for a note taker. We can rotate and things like that. And that's all I've got. Paris.
Paris, are you still hardware muted in the room?
Hey, can you hear me now? All right, go.
Yes.
We are going to continue a meet our contributors, ask us anything type of office hours on a monthly basis. Our next one is February 7th. I will put the link in the doc here shortly, but we'll actually do 2 times. We'll do a 8:30 a.m. Pacific time as well as an afternoon time TBA. But this is intended to help out either new contributors or current contributors with questions that they have and they want to talk to a human, just sort of learning on demand. So if you are a contributor and want to help out with this, please see me. We actually have enough contributors for the morning hour session, but the afternoon PST session we do not. And that's it.
Thank you, Paris. A couple of people in the chat are asking, hey, how do I actually sign up to take notes? First, obviously, it's a Google Doc, so type, pull it up, and collaboratively make it happen. But it is also useful to have somebody who is specifically tagged with making sure the bulk of it is getting done. George, do you have a preferred process for somebody to reach out to you on that?
I will figure it out and add it to the top of the doc.
Sweet, thank you. All right, that takes us to the end of our agenda for the day. Is there anything else that anybody needs to bring up? All right, thanks everybody for joining, and you get a little bit of time back in your hour. Have a great day.
Thanks, Tim.